There is a specific, deeply uncomfortable type of quiet that settles over a suburban supermarket at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. It isn't the silence of an empty building. It's the low, ambient hum of fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead, the dull squeak of a shopping cart wheel against polished linoleum, and the silent collective calculation happening in the minds of a dozen people standing in the canned foods aisle. They aren't looking at the labels for nutrition facts. They are staring at the small, yellow shelf tags, trying to reconcile a memory from 6 months ago with the reality sitting right in front of them. Most people look, feel a faint pang of irritation, drop the item into their cart anyway, and move on. They treat it as an isolated incident, a bad harvest, a temporary supply chain glitch, a localized price adjustment. They convince themselves that next month, or maybe next quarter, the trajectory will level off. They are dead wrong. For 11 months, I have been recording every single transaction across 10 basic, indispensable staple categories: dates, specific store locations, volume, and exact dollar amounts. It started as a minor personal experiment, a spreadsheet born out of mild curiosity when a single batch of groceries felt slightly more expensive than usual. But 3 weeks ago, the data crossed a threshold that shifted the exercise from passive observation to immediate, aggressive action. The numbers didn't just indicate inflation, they revealed a systemic shift, a synchronized price ascent across product lines that share virtually no logistical, agricultural, or manufacturing overlap. When a specialized imported luxury item goes up, you can blame a regional drought or an international shipping bottleneck. But when the most domestic, abundantly produced, heavily subsidized staples in the American food system jump 25 to 40% in less than 2 quarters, the isolated explanations collapse. What you are looking at is not a temporary fluctuation. It is a fundamental recalculation of what it costs to maintain basic human nutrition. This week, I went to the store and bought 10 specific items in quantities far exceeding my immediate needs. I didn't buy them because I was planning a complex menu for the weekend. I bought them because every single one of them is climbing at a rate that makes holding cash look like a guaranteed loss, and every metric I track suggests they are nowhere near their peak. Consider the floor of the American pantry: canned vegetables, corn, green beans, peas. They are the background noise of the grocery industry, produced in astronomical volumes across the Midwest, processed in ultra-efficient industrial facilities, and distributed through long-established, highly optimized domestic networks. For years, a standard 15-ounce can sat anchored at 90 cents. It was the ultimate budget stabilizer, the thing that remained immune to market chaos. Over the last 6 months, that same can quietly migrated to $1.12. A 20% increase. It sounds trivial when expressed in pennies. 22 cents seems like pocket change. But in the world of industrial agriculture, a 20% shift in 6 months on the cheapest, most abundant domestic product in the entire store isn't a minor bump. It is a structural alarm. It means the underlying operational costs, fertilizer, diesel, aluminium, labor, and transport, has saturated the very base of the supply chain. When pressure reaches the absolute floor of a market, it doesn't dissipate. It builds, and it pushes everything above it higher. And yet, the financial movement is only half the crisis. There is a psychological trap built into prolonged periods of food inflation that destroys pantry strategies long before the money runs out. It's a phenomenon known in dietary psychology and military logistics as appetite fatigue. When budgets tighten, households instinctively narrow their purchases to pure starches and dense proteins, dry beans, plain rice, basic flour. On paper, the calories balance. On paper, the survival math works. But human beings are not engines that run on raw caloric intake alone. When a household is forced to cycle through the exact same 3 or 4 untextured, flavor-neutral meals day after day, a physiological resistance sets in. Meals are skipped, Unplanned, expensive convenience purchases are made out of sheer frustration. The carefully planned reserve collapses because it ignored human behavior. Canned vegetables are financially insignificant, but functionally, they are the structural element that prevents a meal rotation from feeling like a punishment. They provide texture, acidity, and visual variety, the exact sensory inputs required to keep a baseline food strategy operational over months rather than days. Last Tuesday, I bought 18 cans across corn, peas, and green beans, locking in a total of $19.80. 6 months ago, that exact transaction was $16. The gap is modest, but the trajectory it introduces is precise. And as you move up the list, from domestic canned staples to raw fats, shelf-stable proteins and foundational grains, that gap widens from a trickle into a torrent. The system isn't breaking, it is repricing itself from the ground up. And the people who wait for the official metrics to confirm what is already happening on the shelf are the ones who end up paying the difference. The structural escalation seen across consumer retail shelves in recent months is not an accidental phenomenon, nor is it the result of a single isolated shock. To understand how basic domestic commodities arrived at current price levels, it is necessary to examine a sequence of policy shifts, agricultural cost structures, and supply chain consolidations that developed over the past 4 years. The current retail environment represents the cumulative output of multiple systemic pressures converging on production, processing, and distribution channels simultaneously. Beginning in early 2021, global agricultural input costs experienced unprecedented volatility. The global price of synthetic fertilizers, specifically nitrogen-based compounds like anhydrous ammonia, urea, and ammonium nitrate, surged sharply. Between mid-2020 and late 2022, natural gas prices, which serve as the primary feedstock for nitrogen fertilizer synthesis, spiked across global markets. Because nitrogen fertilizer accounts for roughly 15 to 20% of the variable operating costs for large-scale domestic grain and vegetable farming in North America, the cost of cultivating basic crops rose instantly. Midwestern corn and soybean growers, who form the foundation of the domestic feed, oil, and canned food sectors, saw their baseline input expenditure per acre increase by more than 60% over a 24-month window. Simultaneously, agricultural operations face sustained increases in diesel fuel prices. Commercial farming relies heavily on ultra-low sulfur diesel to power high-tonnage machinery, including tractors, combine harvesters, and irrigation pumps, as well as the heavy transport fleets required to haul raw agricultural commodities from field to processing plant. When diesel prices hit historical highs across North American freight corridors, the cost per ton-mile for moving raw farm output rose proportionately. Unlike high-margin manufactured consumer goods, low-cost bulk agricultural products have narrow profit margins. Consequently, even minor shifts in freight tariffs force immediate upward adjustments in farm gate and wholesale prices. While field production costs were escalating, the domestic processing sector encountered its own structural constraints. Over the past 3 decades, the American food processing industry underwent intense corporate consolidation. Today, a small number of multinational conglomerates control the vast majority of processing facilities for canned vegetables, edible oils, meat processing, and grain milling. While this extreme consolidation maximized operational efficiency during periods of economic stability, it created a highly rigid processing network with zero excess capacity. When energy costs, industrial packaging materials, and labor wages rose across 2022 and 2023, processing facilities had limited operational flexibility to absorb those expenses. For example, the cost of prime food-grade tinplate steel and aluminum used in commercial canning increased by more than 30% over a 3-year period, driven by global metal market volatility and elevated smelting energy costs. The physical container housing canned corn, green beans, or tomatoes suddenly represented a significantly larger percentage of the item's total bill of materials than the raw agricultural content inside it. A parallel dynamic unfolded in the domestic edible oil and protein sectors. The price of cooking oil, particularly soybean, canola, and vegetable oil blends, is tightly linked to both international trade flows and domestic renewable fuel mandates. Under federal biofuel policies, an increasing volume of domestically produced soybean oil has been diverted away from the commercial food supply toward the production of renewable diesel and biodiesel. This regulatory demand shift created direct competition between the energy sector and the commercial food sector for the same underlying agricultural commodities. As processing plants allocated larger volumes of crude vegetable oil to fuel refineries, the remaining supply available for consumer food packaging shrank, driving retail bottle prices up by nearly 40% over a short operational window. The situation in animal proteins, such as canned chicken and tuna, reflects a distinct set of environmental and logistical pressures. The North American poultry sector has been battling a multi-year outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza, which resulted in the depopulation of tens of millions of commercial birds since 2022. The loss of laying hens and broiler flocks created severe supply contractions across egg and meat markets, sending raw poultry prices upward. For commercial processors producing shelf-stable canned chicken, raw material supply became both more expensive and less predictable, forcing wholesale price revisions that quickly passed directly to retail grocers. In the case of honey, the 40% price increase observed over recent tracking cycles highlights a biological and agricultural crisis rather than a purely mechanical supply chain bottleneck. Commercial apiculture in North America has faced persistent colony loss rates exceeding 40% annually, driven by parasitic mites, habitat loss, and extreme weather events. Maintaining commercial bee colonies for both crop pollination and honey production now requires significantly higher labor, chemical treatment, and supplemental feeding expenditures. Because domestic honey production cannot meet total market demand, the supply deficit is filled by imports, which are subject to ocean freight tariffs, international trade regulations, and strict quality verification checks to prevent adulteration. Furthermore, retail grocers themselves transformed their pricing algorithms over the last 3 years. Modern supermarket chains utilize dynamic pricing models that monitor velocity, wholesale replacement costs, and regional competitor pricing in real time. Historically, grocers use staple items like rice, canned vegetables, and cooking oil as loss leaders, items priced at or near cost to drive foot traffic into physical stores. However, as general operating expenses for retail stores rose, including commercial electricity for refrigeration, property insurance, and floor labor, retailers largely abandoned the traditional loss leader strategy. Instead, baseline staple categories were repriced to maintain fixed profit margins across every aisle, removing the historic price floor that had previously shielded consumers from wholesale commodity shifts. Every link in the chain, from fertilizer synthesis and field harvest to industrial canning, freight transit, and algorithmic shelf pricing, has experienced sustained compounding cost increases. The price tags currently appearing on supermarket shelves are not temporary anomalies. They are the direct mathematical output of a structural cost recalculation that has worked its way through the entire global and domestic food economy. The ongoing transformation of retail food pricing has escalated from a quiet back-end supply chain adjustment into an active economic conflict, pitting federal regulatory policy, corporate distribution models, state authorities, and consumer budgets against one another. As key baseline food categories reach historic price levels, the structural pressure across the domestic agricultural landscape has revealed deep operational deadlocks across every level of the distribution network. At the federal level, the collision between environmental regulatory mandates and agricultural production requirements has produced immediate friction. Federal initiatives aimed at accelerating the transition toward renewable energy have mandated higher blending volumes for biomass-based diesel. According to industry reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and energy tracking agencies, this regulatory push has redirected billions of pounds of domestic soybean oil away from human food production and directly into biorefineries. Agricultural trade groups have repeatedly warned federal regulators that diverting primary edible oil stocks into fuel production during periods of high food inflation creates an artificial supply deficit for food manufacturers. However, Energy sector incentives continue to outbid food processors for raw agricultural fats, maintaining upward pressure on commercial cooking oil prices across all retail channels. Simultaneously, the domestic freight and logistics infrastructure faces systemic gridlock that directly impacts shelf-stable food distribution. Interstate trucking companies, which handle over 70% of all domestic food freight by weight, have faced mounting operating expenses, including elevated commercial insurance premiums, stringent driver labor regulations, and increased fleet maintenance costs. When regional freight hubs experience disruptions or diesel price spikes, transport logistics firms immediately apply fuel surcharges and route adjustments. Major food manufacturers, operating under tight profit margins, no longer absorb these transit surcharges. Instead, contractual terms between food processors and national retail chains now automatically pass transport cost increases directly through to the wholesale billing price. In the grocery sector, major national retail conglomerates and regional supermarket chains have engaged in intense corporate margin management. Financial disclosures from publicly traded grocery operators reveal that while overall sales volume by unit has flatlined or decreased in certain categories over the last 4 quarters, net dollar revenue has remained elevated. This dynamic indicates that price increases are driving revenue growth even as consumers purchase fewer physical items. Labor unions representing retail supermarket workers have pointed to these corporate financial results during contract negotiations, arguing that wage growth has failed to keep pace with the cost of basic consumer goods sold in the very stores where their members work. In response, store operators cite rising commercial real estate leases, soaring municipal utility bills for refrigeration infrastructure, and increased rates of inventory loss as primary justifications for maintaining higher shelf prices. The situation in staple proteins highlights the reality of these operational constraints. Commercial poultry producers, operating under strict federal biosecurity protocols due to ongoing avian influenza outbreaks, have incurred hundreds of millions of dollars in containment, sanitation, and flock replacement costs. For commercial canning facilities processing chicken and tuna, raw material procurement has become erratic. Major ocean fishing fleets supplying canned tuna processors have faced higher marine fuel expenditures, stricter international catch quotas, and elevated port processing fees. When raw tuna imports dock at coastal processing facilities, the total cost per metric ton reflects these compounding maritime expenses. As a result, canned tuna, long considered the ultimate low-cost, zero-prep protein for budget-conscious households, has experienced a rapid 25% retail increase within a single calendar year. The baseline staple of the global food supply, rice, presents the most stark example of this systemic pressure. While North American rice production in states such as Arkansas, California, Louisiana, and Mississippi remains technologically advanced, growers have faced unprecedented operational cost increases. The price of specialized agricultural machinery, irrigation electricity, water rights management, and field labor has climbed steadily. Furthermore, global rice markets experience severe volatility following trade restrictions and export quotas implemented by major international producers seeking to secure their domestic supplies. This global tightening placed immediate pressure on North American commercial buyers, driving wholesale prices for bulk 20-pound and 50-pound bags of white and brown rice to levels not seen in prior economic cycles. Because rice serves as the primary caloric anchor for tens of millions of low-income and working-class families, a 30% price jump in this category removes the final safety net in household food budgeting. State agricultural departments and consumer protection agencies have begun investigating regional price discrepancies, tracking instances where wholesale commodity drops fail to produce corresponding decreases on supermarket shelves. Analysts observe a structural phenomenon known as sticky prices, wherein retail prices rapidly adjust upward in response to wholesale cost increases, but demonstrate extreme resistance to moving downward when underlying commodity prices cool. Retailers defend this lag by citing long-term procurement contracts signed during peak inflation periods, which lock in higher wholesale acquisition costs for months after spot market prices decline. As these economic forces continue to interact, the margin for error within the domestic food system has narrowed to zero. Households are increasingly reliant on short-term credit, high-yield debt, or severe budget reallocations simply to maintain standard caloric intake. The steady upward recalibration of basic shelf prices across canned vegetables, honey, coffee, cooking oil, dried beans, peanut butter, canned proteins, tomatoes, and rice confirms that the domestic food economy has entered a permanent higher-cost paradigm with no systemic mechanism in place to force a return to previous price levels.